Smith. I'm on the MICA staff. Your presenters today are Christina Soulard and Angela Gautry. And we will get started here. You are on mute. If you need to ask a question, please put it in either the chat box or you can raise your hand to be unmuted. If you need to sign in, a lot of people have already started putting their names in the chat box. That's great. I've already started adding you to the list. However, I will also be putting a link down at the end of our session for you to sign out when you're done. Of course, I'll also be watching for you to sign out as well. Keep your eyes on the chat. We'll also have a forms link later on there for a survey as well. So if you don't have the chat open, click that little chat box on your toolbar. Welcome everybody, and let's go ahead and get started.
All right. All right, welcome everybody. You guys can probably see me. My name is Angela Gautry. Thank you for the introduction, Thurston. So we just wanted to go through a brief agenda today. First off, ESG, what's the latest? We're going to be getting into some details about HMIS, specifically about reporting groups, the CAPER report, and the submission process. And then Christina is going to follow up with some next steps from the MSHDA perspective. We'll also have some additional resources, helpful tools, different guidance that might help you along the way, and then we'll round out with a Q&A. So before we jump into the agenda, we wanted to get an idea of who's in the room. So if you guys could take a second and fill out the poll that is going to be in a link in the chat box that Thurston's going to be adding right now. Just so that we have a good gauge on who we're presenting to. Hopefully, we can also cater to those questions that come in if you guys have specific ones about the HMIS process or about any specific role that you guys have in submitting the CAPER or just in ESG-CV in general. So we're just going to give you guys a few minutes to fill this out. And then Thurston, if you don't mind giving us a tally once we have some coming in.
Absolutely.
We also recognize that people might be filling a few of these different roles, so you can select a couple different options if you need a couple of these different roles. All right, so what are we looking at right now?
I'm not seeing any responses so far.
Oh.
Oh, wait, here they go. Now it's populating.
Okay, great.
Okay. So it looks like so far of our first category grantees, 7 people, fiduciaries 4, sub-grantees 5, no independent jurisdictions so far, HMIS sysadmins 14, and other 4.
Okay, great. All right, perfect. So we have a lot of HMIS people here and some, grantees as well. So this will be a great session. So I'm going to hand it off right now to Christina to go over what's the latest for ESG.
Great. Thanks, Angela. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining us in this conversation today. I'm just going to set a little bit of minimal background as far as ESG-CV goes, and specifically to the MSHDA ESG-CV funding. So as most everybody realizes now, we had the first round applications that we started in May working through, and then we were able to get the first round funding available to communities in August of this year. And I think I have that set up for animation, Angela, so it might take a couple of clicks to add the rest of the info. Yep, sorry, thanks. So round 2 funding, we've been kind of delayed a bit in getting to the round 2 funding as far as setting out an application or a process for that because we were still setting up first round funding. But we are going to move into second round funding in November. We're going to have more information coming out about that over the next couple of weeks. Second round funding, we've alerted communities through our newsletters that we're looking at roughly the same amount as the first round funding for each of our grantees. And the applications, though, we're going to do it as an amendment to the existing grant, which will make it a little bit easier to get the funding out to communities. We are still going to allow for new sub-grantees to come in under the second round funding as well. And we'll have, like I said, some more guidance coming out about that funding in the next couple of weeks. And then as you saw, if you attended the plenary with HUD yesterday, Brett Elders from the federal level commented on the HUD guidance that came out at the beginning of September, which referenced a couple of new funding categories, such as volunteer incentives, landlord incentives, and other aspects like that. So we are going to incorporate some of that guidance into the second round of funding as well. And then the big thing that we're here in large part to talk about today is the ESG-CV CAPER. So again, this will be specific to the MSHDA ESG-CV funding, but I think there's going to be a lot of really good information that Angela's going to get into that's applicable to our independent jurisdictions as well that have direct recipients of funding at the city and county level. But that first CAPER is due tomorrow, and then it'll go quarterly after that. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Angela to start getting into some of those tips that we've been talking about.
All right, thank you. So we're amidst the first CAPER submission. We actually submitted ours a few days ago. So in preparation for that, there was a lot of back-end work that we had to do. And so I thought this presentation would also be helpful for you guys to kind of just name out some different tips and considerations that you guys can think about when submitting the next CAPER. Or if you're an agency that receives ESG funding, just some special considerations to look at when you're looking at your data. So I really wanted to just provide these, kind of basic tips just for some context before I kind of dive real deep in here. Anything that you want more, specific information on, we generally have a pretty good document or training to go along with it. So without any more delay, so first we're going to get started by just reviewing HMIS provider pages and reporting groups. So for those of you that aren't as HMIS savvy, HMIS provider pages are basically set up on our service point HMIS for each project funded through ESG-CV. Pages are going to be where the data is stored and organized for a specific project. So this is going to be any page, basically any project within the community that serves people that are homeless. However, for this session, we're really going to be focusing our attention in on the ESG-CV projects. So when you're thinking about your provider pages, specifically for individuals on the call that are HMIS leads, agency administrators, or just want to know a little bit more about HMIS, there's a really helpful resource that's available on the Learning Center that's titled HMIS Provider Page Creation and Settings Guidance Document. So that document's excellent. It's a step-by-step approach about how to fill out a provider page. The provider page is going to be basically the back end of what you're filling out or what's going to be filled out on the front end for people doing data entry. So there's going to be a lot of important information on that document. It's a great document to refer to when you're creating a new provider pages. As Christina had just mentioned, there is going to be additional funding. So if there are circumstances where a new page needs to be created, that's a great resource to have on hand. The next part that's going to be really important for any HMIS people is auditing your HMIS provider pages. So I know that you guys are probably tired of hearing this from us. We probably ask you every week or two to look at your provider pages, make sure that they're accurate. However, now we have a really great report that's available on Click. Click is a kind of different universe in the HMIS that provides reporting in a different way from our traditional ART reports. So I haven't been in Click too much, but this report is actually very easy to read and understand. It's the Click report, it's the REQ 102. I do not know what REQ stands for, but there's also a nice document on the Learning Center that kind of steps you through the process for how to run the report and how to read it. It's fairly straightforward. Things to look for when you are doing your audit is going to be, are going to be the naming protocol. So making sure you have the correct title for the name of your project. This makes it so much easier for when we're searching out your MSHDA projects, or if you're a local jurisdiction, it'll make it a lot easier for you to identify who's been funded in your community. Naming protocol should really include project type, funding source, and then your COC, agency name as well. Other things you want to be looking at when you look at this report are going to be your project type. That's going to be a key. I'm going to probably say that 100 times during this presentation. Make sure you have the correct project type on your page. You cannot get too far if you don't have that correctly on your page. And then also including your operating start date. The operating start date is going to be 3/1/2020 for all MSHDA ESG-CV projects. That's the date that MSHDA had determined as the funding start date. So if you are an independent jurisdiction or have some local city or county funding, that date might be a bit different depending on when funds were actually released to your community. What else? So we have our COC code. Make sure that that is open during your grant term. Same as your bed and unit inventory. The bed and unit inventory is going to be very important. If you guys have the opportunity, you know, now please just add in a placeholder if you don't have one already. We know that with new projects, you're not going to know exactly how many people you're serving in, say, you know, motel vouchers or rapid rehousing. You're probably not going to know that for a few months. And so once you have some data and can get a good gauge on the average number of people you're serving, you can go ahead and update your bed and unit inventory to reflect the average night of number of people served. That's going to be really important when it comes time for the LSA, which is coming up, the system performance measures, and the HIC. So your bed and unit inventory is key. And then finally, what one last thing is going to be your federal partner funding source, making sure that you have the HUD ESG as the funding source. Right now, we know that there is going to be a HUD ESG CV funding source, but that's not quite available yet. We'll let you guys know when it is, and then also making sure that you have an open grant during that funding term, or that grant term. The grant term for the MSHDA grants is 3/1/2020 to 9/30/2022. I feel like I've probably filled that one in quite a bit over the last few weeks. So those could be your standard ones for ESG-CV.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so your reporting groups. So your reporting groups are basically going to be a group of your pages. They're going to be built by project type on a quarterly or cumulative basis. This is basically your bundle. I have been using bundle and reporting groups kind of interchangeably. I know that that can be confusing for people. So I'm just going to say reporting groups for this presentation, but basically your reporting group is going to be matching your bundle. You guys probably already know this. You've been through a lot of HUD webinars. If not, there are a lot of HUD webinars that go into detail about what a bundle is and how that's set up on the SAGE backend. But right now we're just going to go through some specifics about reporting groups in HMIS. So just keep in mind, reporting groups are going to be built as a reflection of the bundles for the same time period that your recipient is requesting. If you are the recipient, you're going to be the one making the request for these HMIS bundles, so you can just get a good idea of what's going to be happening on the HMIS side. So one thing that's going to be really important is going to be a naming protocol. I can't stress enough that a naming protocol will make things so much easier when you're searching out any reporting group when you're running a report. If you have, the name of your city or your jurisdiction, the funding source, and the project type, that's going to be super helpful. But then you can see here, I've also included the time frame. So that's going to be 3/1/2020 to 9/30/22. This is just an example. I live in Hamtramck, so that's why I'm going to use it as an example. So 3/1/2020. So you're going to use it for the time frame for which you're going to be reporting. So if you have a good naming protocol, it'll make it easier when you're searching things out. It'll also make it easier if you need to reference prior reports. You can go ahead and look at the reporting group to see who's been, if there are any projects that have come off or have come on. It makes things just that much easier. And then if you are able to, it's also helpful for the next round to consider adding a cumulative at the end of another reporting group. So you'll have your general reporting group for a quarter, and then you'll also have a cumulative one that's ongoing. All right, one of my main recommendations here is talking to your ESG recipient early and often. Our ESG recipient is MSHDA, so we've been having open conversations, I feel like almost daily, kind of working things out. It's important to know which projects are being funded and some of that contact information for those projects. So setting up that communication and talking to your recipient early will help you in the process of making those bundles. They'll help you determine which projects are coming on, which ones are coming off. What I mentioned before, if you need to get in touch with a specific agency, the recipient will usually have that contact information, whether it's an email or phone number. And it'll just really help you through that process. And then finally, for reporting groups and for your provider pages, I would recommend creating a project master list. So if you are a community that has multiple layers of funding, so let's say you have some ESG-CV from the state and from the city and from the county, it can get kind of confusing really quickly. And it can also be pretty confusing if, one shelter is receiving all three streams of funding. So one way to kind of keep this straight is to kind of set up your own master list. I did something similar in Excel where you basically just create a list of your projects, how they're funded, the HMIS numbers. I included the contact information for each page. So whether it's a balance of state community or if there's a direct system administrator over that grant, knowing who to contact is going to be extremely helpful. And this can also be a running list. So when projects come off, you can make a note, and when projects come on, you can add them to the list. It's just incredibly helpful when you're, doing that final bundling. All right. So that kind of wraps up HMIS provider pages and reporting groups. So I'm going to move to the next step of the process, which is your CAPER. All right, CAPER. Who knows what CAPER stands for? I had to look it up because I probably forgot the first day I found out. CAPER is the Consolidated Annual Performance Evaluation Report. That's a mouthful. I don't want to say it again, so I'm just going to say CAPER. So it's the report that's going to capture all your data for people being served by ESG-CV. The one important thing and why it's really important for MSHDA with the CAPER is that it represents where the dollars are being spent and where the clients are being served. So it includes a lot of, you guys will probably know if you're familiar with the report, it includes demographic information, income, disability, outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of really good information that you can get from this one report. And then what's important too is if you're a community that has a, an ESG-CV project, you can actually run the CAPER report by that individual project. Or if you're an HMIS lead, you can be the one, you're most likely being the one running it by the reporting group. So I'm going to provide a few helpful things when it comes to the CAPER. I'm going to start with some kind of overall things you can do. Then I'm going to get into some specifics about HMIS. All right, so the first document I'm going to reference you guys to is going to be the Finding and Fixing Data Quality Errors in the ESG CAPER document. That is available on the Learning Center website. It's a very awesome detailed breakdown of each data element in the CAPER and how to, it goes through basically how to read the report, what to look for, and it gives a little bit of detail of like how things are pulled in as well. So it really helps to identify what areas you need to look for when you're completing the data quality review. The link to this report and kind of some other documents that I'm talking about will be available in our resources page at the end of the presentation. This is also a great document for people that don't really understand HMIS or aren't in the HMIS world. So it could be used in accompanying the CAPER when you're maybe sending it to your executive leadership for a final review, or when you're taking it to the outcomes committee. A lot of times people that aren't in HMIS may not be looking at these reports, but it's a nice way for for you as an HMIS lead or even a recipient to look at the report and then also look at this kind of helpful document in addition to it and see like, okay, so this says that Social Security number, well, there's an error rate of 30%. What does that mean? Oh, well, I can look at this document and figure out, oh, okay, so it's saying that like 30% of people have an error with that data quality element. So it's really helpful and it's very straightforward. So I would definitely recommend using that in addition to fixing or in addition to, when you present your CAPER or when you're just using it in general to make those changes. The next one is really running your CAPER on a monthly basis. We know that projects are going to be coming on, projects are going to be coming off, so you're going to want to be able to talk to your recipient to figure out what those are, but more importantly, you're really going to be using this monthly poll to review your data quality and outcomes within the program. This allows you time to catch issues early on. You'll be able to see how any new agencies are doing. So if you notice that agency X is brand new to HMIS and they tend to be having a lot of issues with the chronic question, that will definitely flag in parts of the CAPER. And so with that information, you can kind of stop that early on, catch that early on, and go to that agency and see if there's some additional training that needs to be done, a more clarification of the definition. And so this will just help you with the submission process and make things a little less crazy when you're getting ready to review and submit. One thing that I would find very helpful in an independent jurisdiction, especially for, or not even independent jurisdiction, any HMIS lead, whether you are at the system level or if you're at the agency level, is to establish a data error threshold. you might want to work with your COC or your agency to create a threshold. So what I'm talking about here is on the CAPER, each data element actually has an error rate next to it as a percentage. And so my recommendation would be to establish a threshold. So let's say 5%. So what I would do is say any area within the CAPER that has an error rate of 5% or more is where I'm going to prioritize my time for making those changes or trying to figure out where those fixes are. And so it's not always just about data quality, but maybe getting a better understanding of what's happening within your system. So maybe there's an error rate, like what I was saying, of 20% with Social Security numbers, but you know it's a youth project, and you know that youth aren't required to enter in their full SOS. And so that would be an explanation for why that number would be high. However, just, you know, bringing attention to those error rates that are higher than 5% allows you to figure out what's happening and see if there is room for improvement, or just to get a better understanding of what's going on. The next one, create a CAPER line of communication. So figuring out who you're working with, and this can be, you know, if you're an HMIS lead, or if you are, you know, internally just one agency kind of reviewing their CAPER on a monthly basis. Create a line of communication. Who's your core team? Who's going to be at the table? Who's going to help you review the CAPER? Who's going to give the okay to submit? And so making sure that, you know, participation is key. The CAPER is not just an HMIS thing. This is so important to remember. You know, HMIS leads and HMIS agency administrators and staff doing data entry also need the support from leadership to make sure that they're, you know, heading in the right direction. So making sure that everybody that needs to know is you have that line of communication with them, and maybe you establish some roles and responsibilities. So who's going to be doing the data cleanup, and what time frame are you going to be using? So are you going to give them 2 weeks to do data cleanup, 1 week? So really creating just this communication. And there are a ton of tools out there to do this. There's Basecamp, there's Microsoft Teams, even just setting up an email thread. But it's nice to have one, you know, stream or area where everybody working on one project can add in input. All right, and then finally for the CAPER overview, don't worry, everyone in the entire country is literally going through the same process. We've had to submit a few AAQs. It happens. Micah's here to help, Misha's here to help. And, you know, if you can take, you know, once you submit it, reward yourself, because it's scary, it's a burden, and it's new, but everybody's in this together. And so, you know, treat yourself to something nice, or a nice meal if you can. All right, now I'm going to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the CAPER. So anyone who is familiar with HMIS, this will be a helpful time. So what are some specific things to look for in the CAPER? So most importantly, one of the most important things right off the bat, double check your prompts and identifiers, making sure you have the right time frame. This is going to be important for when you submit your quarter and cumulative reports. Don't forget your project type. Project type is obviously very important. Your assessment type. So you can choose a HUD assessment or a variety of different assessments. Make sure you include all the ones that are applicable. I know as a system administrator, I always forgot to include the RI ones. And so just making sure that you have the correct assessment types. And then making sure when you do run that you can see that there will be like a list of different agencies and everything that pull in. So just doing that cross check. So there's also, this is just a really helpful hint. There's a really nice button by the report when you run it that says use previous parameters. If you're going to be doing data cleanup at the same time when you're doing running the report. It's really frustrating because every time you exit out of the report, you'd have to rerun it. Well, this little helpful button will allow you to fill in all the parameters based on what you had just entered in. I think this even works when you exit the system altogether. So if you actually sign out of HMIS, it's really helpful. I've actually used this quite a bit, and it's just makes things so much easier. You don't have to fill the prompts in every time. Another little tool here is the highlight clients. So if you're noticing that clients are have errors in multiple sections of the CAPER, you can actually type in that client's name or ID at the top. You can't really see it here. And then you search them out, and then it's going to highlight in each area where that person is pulling in. So a lot of times we know when there's a data entry problem or a visibility issue, it usually has to do with only like a handful of clients, or if it is like it's a client that has multiple errors across the whole CAPER. And so that'll give you kind of an easier way to see if that's the case, or if it's kind of an individual process. So that's just another helpful tool. All right, so the next one, project identifiers. You guys, project type, COC code, geocodes. Geocode is one that I haven't talked about yet. So geocode is really important. That's going to be in your COC code area. They will not let you submit paper without this. If you don't know what your geocode is, there is a document on the Learning Center website that has a full list of all of them. So the next one is going to be really important for your CAPER line of communication. So as we know, there are usually pretty distinct roles at an agency, or sometimes a single person's doing everything. So depending on how you're set up, you're going to want to confirm the number of persons served with staff. So what I'm really saying here is that it's really hard to gauge if your numbers are correct if you're not the one meeting with clients. So, there might be a scenario where the HMIS leads pull a report, 100 people pull in, but then when they talk to staff to see, who's been served by the project so far, they say that there's been 500. So right away, you wouldn't know this off the bat because you weren't the individuals working directly with the clients. So doing that cross-check with people that are kind of, doing the case management, boots on the ground, or that have a better sense of what the numbers should look like. So you can kind of catch that early. It can be part of your, CAPER line of communication, and also just part of your monthly review is just confirming, those numbers with the director, manager, or even, staff that are doing the work on the ground. All right, the next one's a given. Fix missing or incorrect information when you're able to. Errors will populate for all sorts of reasons. So if there's information missing, client doesn't know, client refused, or data not collected, those are the main ones. But we also know there's a plethora of visibility issues, entry issues. So fix any missing or incorrect information. You can use that threshold if you create one to figure out where you want to focus your attention on in making those changes or updates. Okay, the next one is going to be tracking timeliness. And so this isn't, kind of a newer one. So timeliness is the time it takes for data to be entered into the system. It's broken down into these different time frames. You might want to be working directly with your COC or HMIS lead to come up with a timeliness expectation or policy for your COC or even your agency. The thing here, you can use this in a lot of different ways. Not only, is it important to catch information as live to the real time as possible, but it also can identify, maybe there's room for more like case management staff or something. Maybe more staffing is needed, or maybe we need to get another laptop or a tablet out in the field so they can do live data entry. so that we are not doing it at the end of the month when the report is due. So that'll be kind of a nice way to just review how long it's taking data to be entered in. This, of course, will be dependent on the different roles that people play in your community. All right, so finally for the CAPER, review your outcomes and plan for the next quarter. So it's awesome to review data quality, but it's also super important to look at your outcomes. So that outcomes might include discharge destination, income source, insurance at exit, timeliness, like I just mentioned. So review these and see if there are any, overarching trends. Those can be, beneficial. Maybe you have a really great best practice at your emergency shelter where everybody's exiting to permanent housing. Well, maybe, that would be, maybe you're doing something different. Maybe you're doing something unique. So maybe take that information to your outcomes committee or to your, even back to your CAPER line of communication and say, hey, we're doing a really good job here. Maybe we have a best practice. Maybe we can share that with other agencies. And, at MICA, we love to hear about best practices. So if you guys have other tips or, recommendations for what's working well in your community, please share them because those would be helpful for everybody. All right, so I only have one more section, guys. And so now we've talked about your provider pages, we talked about your bundles or your groups, and then how to run a CAPER. So now it's time for SAGE. So SAGE is the HMIS reporting repository that is used for submitting the CAPER to HUD. So I've kind of formatted this section specifically for the HMIS lead for people that are going to be submitting for an ESG-CV or city county. So one important thing to keep in mind, your access is going to really be determined by the recipient. HMIS leads do not need a formal access invite password, username in order to submit the report. So just kind of keep that in mind. There's also a lot of different training up on the HUD website when it comes to the submission process, whether you're the recipient or whether you have some independent funding through a city or county. So my first recommendation is really going to be to use the SAGE practice portal. This allows you to upload your CAPER reporting groups or your bundles that you're going to be adding later on. It allows you to see if there's any errors within the bundles before actually submitting them. You don't have to wait also, because we realize that, during this time frame when when you're submitting for the bundles, you only have like a certain amount of time to do that. You don't really have access to the live site until you have the link, till the link shows up in your email. And so this will give you a space where you can actually look at what is going to be flagged in SAGE. I would recommend, running it through, running your CAPERs through here on a monthly basis, maybe at the same time when you're doing your data quality checks for the month. And then, of course, using that to kind of fix errors before submission. This is kind of a given that you're going to have to confirm your bundles. Time is of the essence. You only have 3 days. 3 days really means 3 days. So even if you have to go back and forth and a recipient has to make changes or an HMIS lead has to make changes, it's a solid just 3 days. So that means, it's going to be important to keep contact with your recipient and address any issues immediately. Really use your CAPER line of communication. And if you guys are really stuck where you can't, get access or you can't make an update on the HMIS or the recipient point of view, you can always send a request up through the AAQ. All right. Next one's also a given. Fix all the errors. You can't do anything unless you fix the errors. So there's a nice guidebook that's going to be included on the resources here that breaks down some common errors and themes for errors. So you'll notice right now that these are going to be a little bit different errors than when we consider data quality errors through the actual CAPER. So some errors that they're going to be looking for in the submission, it's going to be structural errors, report validation errors, project typing errors, and other errors. So an example of a few might be the number of projects in SAGE versus the number of projects in the HMIS reporting group. Once again, an inaccurate project type based on the bundle type. So this guidebook will help identify what those flags mean. So it is a little bit helpful. And then if you haven't gone through this process yet, when you select attach to jurisdiction at the very end, when you have all this HMIS projects in SAGE, when you hit attach to jurisdiction, you're actually submitting. This isn't really clear. I know myself and Thurston both like attached it and they were like, oh, well, let's go back and see what that looks like. You can't. So once it's in there, it's in there. The only way that you'd be able to get it changed, I think, is actually through HUD. And so just keep that in mind. Attach to jurisdiction actually means submit. You can't go back. And then if all else fails and it's something's not working, please, feel free to reach out to the MICA help desk, your MSHDA representative, or the HUD AAQ. We can always direct you to the right place if we don't know the answer ourselves. A lot of things in SAGE are, a little bit limited from an HMIS perspective or even a MSHDA perspective. So the HUD AAQ has been really helpful and they've been quite responsive, so that's great. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it back to Christina for next steps.
Thanks, Angela. That's a lot of really good information, and I know that we've had some great questions coming in on the chat too, so I'm looking forward to that. These next steps are really just to reiterate some of the points that Angela already made in terms of tips, but running the ESG-CV CAPERs is a critical step. So under normal ESG circumstances, our fiduciaries would be submitting CAPERs on a quarterly basis, and they would accompany the financial status report submissions or FSR submissions. And so what we're looking at is how to do the same sort of process under ESG-CV. And really the goal of that is just to help all of our fiduciaries, our grantees, to look at their data more frequently because these submissions under ESG-CV are happening more frequently. So under our annual ESG funding, we submit the CAPER once for the entire year. With ESG-CV, it's being submitted every quarter now to HUD. So the ability of our work to do more of those data quality checks, that time is compressed a bit more, and we understand that. So just looking for ways to encourage more frequent review of the data itself. So we'll have more communication coming out from our team about when to submit ESG-CV CAPER reports being run in addition alongside of the FSR. And then really encouraging to review that data between those FSR submissions too. So Angela already made note of this, but running monthly data quality reports just to stay on top of or ahead of those data quality issues as much as possible is going to be really important during this time. It's a tremendous amount of money that's coming in to meet this pandemic and the crisis. And so there's more expectation to be able to track that large volume of funding. And so taking a close look at our data, understanding what's being submitted under these ESG-CV funds is really important. And then the other note I want to make, and I know Angela brought up some really good tips around communicating about the CAPERs or setting up that communication chain. Well, part of that too is subgrantees. And we know that under the first round of ESG-CV funding that we've had new subgrantees come in, which is excellent, which is absolutely necessary. And we hope to see more new subgrantees identified in the second round of funding as well. But make sure that as a fiduciary, as an HMIS lead, checking in with the subgrantees to make sure that they're aware of the process, helping them to ensure that their pages are set up appropriately within HMIS, that they have a fair understanding of what the work looks like from that perspective, what the responsibilities will be in terms of reporting. We know, it's a lot like a fire hose of information right now for everybody, even for those that are more seasoned in this work. So checking in with one another, but especially checking in with new subgrantees is going to be very important. So from our next steps, I think we have some resources that we want to share quickly, and so I'll turn it back over to Angela.
Okay, I'm just going to breeze through these. So we have a lot of nice resources. Once you guys have the access to the PowerPoint after the presentation, these are all actually all links, so you don't have to go fishing around for them. We have the Learning Center. There's a lot of nice instructional videos that HUD has put out. We also have some specific reporting guidance and what I'd mentioned before, the HUD SAGE guidebook. And then we have some different HMIS manuals if you are super interested in, the clear definitions for how, what the data elements mean in HMIS. There's some really nice definitions in the ESG manual and in the HUD data standards. And then if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of how a report's built, there is this programming specifications. So this is actually used by our vendor to build these reports, but they can be quite helpful if you're trying to figure out how a report is run or why something might be pulling in weird. Those manuals are intense. So be mindful when you start looking at that, it can be a little bit confusing. But anyways, I think we've kind of come to the end of all of our presentation portion, and I think we can open it up for questions now.
Great. I recorded about 6 questions from the chat where I was trying to put in some little answers to some, but I thought, it'd be better if we just discussed this and everybody could hear the answers. So the one from the beginning of the presentation from Victoria says the CV CAPERs are due tomorrow. What is the time frame for the reporting period? And you did cover this a little bit, but I thought maybe it would be good to kind of just lay out explicitly about how it works with the quarters and the cumulative and whatnot.
Okay, yeah, sure. So Victoria, for the MSHDA funding, our grant for the whole state started 3/1/2020. And so that's going to be the start date for when you run the report to 9/30/2020. So 3/1 to 9/30. However, Victoria, I'm not sure where your funding is from. So there might be a different start date. So some communities have started funding, I think in July, August. So that start date might be different. If you are the one submitting the report though, talk to your recipient and they'll tell you what the start date is.
Great. The next one is from Anita. Our agency was informed by MSHDA Michael will be running the CAPERs for ESG-CV. Is that correct information? Maybe just for some agencies and not at all. And I did mention, and you mentioned as well in the presentation that, of course, we're going to be doing that for the state ESG funded programs, but not for city and county. So I wasn't sure if there's anything else to add there.
Right. I think if you're a balance of state community, you'd want to talk to your MICA rep and they'd be able to help you with that process and help you work through it. So otherwise, yep, Thurston, you're right. We are running all of the state ones at the MICA level.
And I think the only group that wouldn't apply to, and I know that there was a follow-up question to this, I think, within the chat, but for those that are using comparable databases. So if it's not coming directly out of HMIS, then the agency has the responsibility to submit that report through the portal link that was provided.
And that's perfect because our next question is about DV. Can you talk about how CAPER reports are handled for DV programs using comparable database? So you just covered part of that. Is there anything else to add on how they should submit that?
Well, I'll start, and then Angela, if you want to chime in with anything additional. But I think that one of the important things that we've kind of talked about internally recently is that because we're having more DV providers coming on as new subgrantees under ESG-CV funding, that we're kind of recognizing more questions coming up about comparable databases and how those actually align, and is it collecting the information that's required as part of the CAPER report. So I think we're going to have to spend some more time over the next couple of months relatively quickly, and especially gearing toward that next CAPER submission, just coming alongside of those providers and helping to clarify questions or things that might be coming up with the report. And I know that we've already had some providers connecting with us at Mission, also with Micah, to kind of sort through some of those questions with this first CAPER. But ensuring that the comparable database is effectively like up to snuff for what the CAPER requires is going to be an important step, especially for our DV partners. But this is also applicable to, we've had some like legal aid services that have applied to do like services only. They're also covered under the comparable database allowance. So that's going to be another conversation that we'll have to have too.
Great. We had a couple of questions come in about Social Security numbers. Jasmine in particular said, are DV providers exempt from putting full Social Security numbers in the systems? So yeah, I wanted to point out that while Social Security numbers are, of course, important, especially on our back end for deduplicating clients and getting all that information, and that it will certainly count as missing data if you don't put that in there. It's always the client's choice whether or not to reveal their Social Security number, whether it's full or partial, when doing data entry. I didn't know if y'all had anything else to add to that.
No, and you have to respect what the individual wants. I empathize. I had my identity stolen a while ago and it sucks. So I understand I'm never giving my Social Security number out unless I really have to. So you'll just be able to, have to make note when you submit the CAPER. If there's something that's really far and outstanding, you might say, well, this is because we're serving a lot of people that are DV. And so that information is not going to be complete. You'll still be able to submit. It's just making a note of why an error rate might look high. But that's a very common one. Social Security numbers is a very common error rate. So, it's a familiar one.
I would imagine, especially with DV clients, for sure. Yeah. Right. Rochelle asks, we sometimes have parents that do not know their children's Social Security number, even after a phone call, and prompts for us to remind them and find the numbers for our data collection. So she's specifically asking, are there any tips or tricks from other agencies or other people to help with that situation? Of course, we talked a little bit about it, how the clients kind of have the right to say no. But as far as I thought maybe this was a little bit getting at, like, how do we make clients feel a little bit more at peace with the fact that this is a secure system and safe to share that kind of information?
Yeah, so one, helpful thing to mention if people are a little, fearful about putting their Social Security number in HMIS is that, as you guys will probably know, a lot like general users don't have access to the full Social Security number. They only have access to the last four. There's only, I think it's only the HMIS system administrators will have access to the full Social Security number. To make changes or updates to it, you have to go through the system administrator. So there is, I guess, things in place to prevent that from happening. And then also just recognizing that the HMIS is a very secure system. We do have security things set up across the system. We also, require a lot of training from our users. And so there are different security measures throughout the HMIS system that would, prevent a general person from getting access into HMIS and then adding or searching out somebody. So there are definitely precautions. And then if you take notice on this, I think our policies and procedures kind of go through a lot of detail about what those security measures are.
Yeah, I'd like to point out too, when I was an admin, I used to like to describe it as I had a discussion with one of my agencies that was actually coaching people not to give permission to share in our coordinated entry system. And I was trying to explain it better to them. And I liked the analogy of a filing cabinet. And with this agreement, you can lay it out in front of them. So here's the agreement of the other agencies we share with. And it's like, you literally know every other person here that has a key to this filing cabinet. So that's the way to think about it, is only these people can see this stuff. It isn't broadcast anywhere. There's no flags being pinged over at, county government or anything like that. It's literally like, here are the people that have keys to the filing cabinet where your file is. And even then, they're not even going to see it unless they're going to hunt for it to serve you for some reason. So that's an analogy that I liked in particular, that I think helped one agency kind of come to better terms with kind of how data is stored in HMIS. Our last question here is from Audrey. It says, at the time of each reporting deadline, quarter and cumulative, will the recipient send a new link to the Sage portal for leads to upload the CAPERs CSV?
Can you repeat the question? Are they going to send a new link for the reporting period, for the new reporting period?
Yeah, I think basically she's asking that at each deadline, is there going to be a new link to submit the new CAPER?
Yeah. So my understanding, and of course we haven't gone through this process yet, but there will be a new link. There'll probably be one that's a cumulative one and a quarter one. Whether they're in the same email or not, I'm not sure. But I'm thinking it's probably going to be a new link. Those links get pretty much like, once you submit it, you can't really do too much else with it.
Yeah.
I would imagine it'd be a new link.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, that was one of the things we anticipated talking about here too, is, what is the next report, or what are the pieces that are going to be out there? We have some of that picture, but I would say probably not all of it yet. We're anticipating more communication from HUD as this process goes. They were fairly intensive in their education around this first report, and even with that, they're as Angela said, we submit a lot of AAQs to HUD about this. And so I think they're learning at the same time that we're learning, and attempting to build it at the same time that we're doing it. So there's going to be new things that we're anticipating that come with the next report.
Great. There were two more questions that came in right here at the end. One is from Stephanie, also about Social Security numbers. She asks, often copies of Social Security numbers are copied as well as in the client file. Does MICA recommend this?
Like their Social Security card?
Yeah, I think that's what she's getting at. Stephanie, you can clarify that. It sounds like you are making copies in the paper file as well as in HMIS. Yep, that's what she says. Yes.
It's not recommended to put the Social Security card on the attachments. I think that's probably a different when you talk about your paper file. So that might be more of an internal process driven by your agency's, procedures. But we don't recommend putting it on there, because if you think about it, in the attachments and the way that you're setting up your visibility, that's basically allowing everybody in your system to have access to that Social Security number. Whereas if it's just written in at the top under the client profile, only those system administrators will have access. So, yeah, edit.
Yeah, it looks like there was. I'm glad that Stephanie brought that up, because it sounds like there was another question from Chris that came in, that he was under the impression that the Social Security card itself was supposed to be uploaded into HMIS. I mean, ultimately, any of those attachments you have apply by the same visibility rules as anything else, right? So if you're sharing attachments with a partner agency, then they're going to be able to see that stuff. Whereas, like you just said, Angela, the putting in the number itself, I mean, after you've put in the number at client creation, the only person that can even edit that is one of us administrators at a higher level. So it's by nature, entering that number in is far more secure, and it's encrypted and hashed and all that stuff when it's used for anything. So that's definitely the most secure method. But the attachments themselves play by those same visibility rules. So if it's locked down to only your agency can see the attachments you make, then only your agency can. But if that's something that's shared in your community, then that would also be shared out as well. So that is definitely something to be careful of. We have another question from Kiana. If data after the quarter, can it be reconciled during the next reporting period?
Christina, you might have helped me with this one. I don't think you can go back and change things. I think from what it sounds like is that you're just going to kind of push forward and keep going, and then you'll have the opportunity, if you are submitting, I think the recipient will have the opportunity to write like some explanations. Christina, do you know anything more about that?
No, but based on the process of the reporting, so both the quarterly and the cumulative, my expectation would be that if there are corrections or additions or changes to the data, that would be reflected within the cumulative report. So you wouldn't go back and redo the quarter, but it would be caught, I guess, in the cumulative process. But again, I think some of that too, we've had some similar questions come up just under this first report that's going in, to say to HUD, like, well, what if, all of these what if scenarios, like what if we have an agency that maybe started and they hadn't put in data yet, but they were trying to put in data, or what if we had, especially along the lines of new subgrantees and kind of what's happening with the timing of that process. And so I think our best bet is likely around the cumulative submissions is where we'd be able to catch some of that.
All right, great. That's all the questions that we have in the chat right now. Thank y'all so much for a great session. Do y'all have any closing comments or anything that you wanted to make before we wrap up today?
I'll just say thank you really quick. I know that we had a lot of folks on the session today. We really appreciate your time, your dedication to this work. There's a lot of things happening right now at multiple levels, and so we just appreciate all that you're doing to kind of keep this work moving forward.
Yeah, thanks guys so much. You guys have been super helpful for the process, and we really do appreciate all the hard work that's been put into making these changes so quickly. It's nuts to think about, 200 projects for MSHDA over a couple month period. So good work, everybody, and keep it up.
Well,
and
thanks
I'll
for. Oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to say thank you to you, Thurston, for moderating this session for us. I also just want to give a shout out to Michelle Edwards on our MSHDA team here, who's really been more of the face of this work. I just had the chance to speak at this session today, but she's been doing tremendous work to help get the ESG-CV first CAPER in, and we'll be doing that going forward. So thank you, Michelle.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for a great session. If you are an attendee that needs to sign the CEU sheet, I just put a link in the chat, actually. I went through and got everybody who said that they signed in, but you can always follow that link and make sure that I got your name. Also, you can sign out by either just putting your name in the chat, or if you want to put your sign out time, this is a shared sheet that I put in here. You can feel free to enter your sign out time, whatever works for you. So just make sure that you say sign out here in the chat box. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and have a great rest of your sessions, the other sessions you attend.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.